All right, Jordan, we're back in the shop.
That's producer
55
Jordan.
T-board, T-Bird. And the really good news is we survived the encounter with the wife.
Barely.
Barely, but we did. And I think when she sees us all polished out, it's only going to get better from there. Can't get worse, let's just say that. Well, let's talk about this car and the history of it. And you and I talked a little bit about it, and I really haven't told you all the people that have owned the car and the history behind it. So let's kind of go through that. Car's built in 1955. So what happened in 1955? Well, just for all you sports fans out there and kids like Jordan, 1955, think about it. Disneyland just opened. First time ever. 1955 in Anaheim, California. What else do we have there? Oh, most important thing, my wife said that the Dodgers won the World Series in 1955, and they did it with one of their best players. Iconic player, Jackie Robinson, number 42. So that's an iconic piece of history back in 1955. And Rosa Parks' infamous thing where she decided, I'm not giving up my bus seat. So that happened in 1955. So when this car was made, history was being made. Not only did Ford make history with the first T-Bird, but other things were happening as well. So, you know, the 60s, this car was around, it was driving, it was doing things, and history was happening as well. Let's take a look at the 60s, for instance, Jordan. You heard of the Civil Rights Movement?
Sure have.
That happened in the 1960s, the whole thing. This country was going up and down, all the stuff, and this car was on the road, and it was part of that history. The Cuban Missile Crisis, another big event. You know, we thought we were at World War III. John F. Kennedy, he was trying to figure out how to handle all that. But John F. Kennedy assassination happened, so man, it's not really a good piece of history to talk about, but it's part of history. It happened. The Apollo 11 moon landing happened. How cool was that? Like the first time people walked on the moon. People hadn't been on the moon when this car was made. Happened in the 60s. Watts riots, Vietnam War, just a couple other things that topped the 60s. The 70s were kind of an era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was, the hippie movement was big. The Jesus Revolution took off. You know, they just had a lot of cool things back in the 70s. A lot of cool music came out of the 70s. But the 80s came along. That's kind of my heyday. Your dad here, you know, high school. I was at my...
That's your dad for the viewers. That's your dad.
Yeah. So, you know, basically, in the early 80s, though, Mount St. Helens erupted. Kind of a big deal. Last time a volcano erupted in the United States, I was actually there. I lived in Battleground, Washington, which is about 25 miles from Mount St. Helens. So I was actually there for that one. I mentioned, well, I guess I didn't mention the Berlin Wall fell. Russia ended, you know, it wasn't a Soviet Union anymore. It kind of broke apart. I didn't know this, but the internet and the computers all started in the 80s. Don't remember it. I was still using peachy folders and pens and paper, but apparently the world was evolving and changing. Tiananmen Square happened in China, big event there. The 90s came along, and, well, that's technically when the Soviet Union ended. But probably the coolest thing about the 90s was that's when Rocky beat the famous fight there when he fought the Russian Ivan Drago, and all the Rocky series are going is really cool. This car was all part of that. All this history has gone on since this car has been born. O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s, that was cool too. In the 2000s, we had September 11th. That was a big deal, obviously, still is a big deal. This car was out and about, hopefully. Hurricane Katrina happened and the Iraq War. So lots of stuff. The whole point of recounting history is that that's part of what's cool about these cars, Jordan, is that it's a piece of history. This is a piece of history and a piece of artwork and something you can drive, and it all tells a story. Now, I don't know who bought this car originally, but I do have 3 separate owners that own this car prior to me. And this obviously will start with the guy I bought the car from. So his name was John J. Morley. I think I told you he's a guy that was a financial wealth management person. So somebody that when people have money and they want to make sure it's going in the right place, that's what he did. And he was very successful at that. He had several clients. One of his clients is who he bought the car from. John J. Morley bought this in 2017. He had it towed because it had been sitting actually in a garage for almost 30, 40 years. So he brought it home, took it to several mechanic shops. They changed out the battery. It was originally, these cars were 6-volt. So when they changed out the battery, started to get it to try to run again, they just changed the whole plan and went to a 12-volt system. That actually is what most cars evolved to in 55, but that's a better system. So they did a 12-volt conversion. He changed out the gas tank, fuel lines, ended up redoing the carburetor. He did a lot of stuff. He did most of it in 2017. I think a little thing came along, COVID, probably shut down a lot of operations. He kind of did everything in 2017 and started up in 2022. I think he had the carburetor rebuilt. He had all the new locks and keys put on so it would operate properly, doors open, ignition. And then he sold the vehicle to me. He kind of lost interest in it and really just wanted to pass the baton, so to speak, off to someone else. Now, he bought the car, as I mentioned, from one of his clients. And a very interesting guy, his client was Dave O'Mara. And Dave O'Mara lived in Malibu, a businessman. And he has a nice article here that basically he started the first movie theater in Malibu. And he wasn't just a guy that started a business and then kind of let somebody else run it. Back in the 70s when he had this, he's the guy that would get your tickets, take your money, run over, get you popcorn and a drink. But he was also doing this in Malibu. I mean, some of the people that came into that place, I wrote some of them down here, that went into these movie theaters and stuff back then. In the story was outlined that, Flip Wilson came in, Lee Marvin, Johnny Carson used to come in there, Barbra Streisand, Bob Dylan. He even, in the story, outlined Martin Sheen would bring his kids down there, and every now and then Dave would take his kids home for him just because something came up and they needed a ride home. So Dave was not just a guy that started a business. He was kind of iconic there. He was a upstanding guy in the community and a pillar of the community, so to speak. So really cool guy. He died in 1993, and that's, his last run with the car. But Dave bought this car. And
so real quick, when did he own the car?
Well, he owned the car. He owned it in 1983. So maybe, yeah.
Okay.
So he bought the car in 83.
So he bought it in the early 80s. You talked about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Tell me about who owned it in the 70s.
Well, let me just point out what he did with the car, which is really interesting. It's great when you buy a car and you have all this paperwork, because one of the things that Dave did was he had the whole engine rebuilt. So that's super cool. And I mean, it wasn't just to add a little here. This was a complete pull the engine out, rebuild the entire engine, put it all back together. So he did a lot of things in 83 with this vehicle. And it looks like, and the story is through the wife who's still alive, she's 90, that he did a lot of work and then the car just sat and then he died. Now, you asked me who he bought the car from. In the 70s, yes, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that was kind of what outlined the 70s. He bought the car from a guy, and in this packet of papers that he had was this guy's picture right here. This is the gentleman in 1983 that he bought the car from. And this was his, I guess, I can't tell if this is a registration or this was the actual pink slip for the car. It's a photocopy, it's old, but it says Harry Reams. That's who he bought the car from. And Harry Reams was a guy that grew up in New York, went into the Marine Corps for a short stint, wanted to be an actor, started taking theater classes in New York, and he stumbled into doing porn. And it was a way to make money, and he thought it might give him his foot in the door, so to speak. And he landed himself on an iconic set of a movie called Deep Throat that ended up becoming this massive, not just in our country, but international. It was a big deal. It was a big deal. I never saw the movie. I was way too young to see that movie. Wouldn't have seen it anyways.
It was the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
It was huge.
But when I heard this originally, I was like, man, I don't know if I want to own a car, this guy, and this kind of life. And I know John J. Morley had advertised that in his advertisement to sell the car. But after talking with John said, yeah, I'm a Christian too. I'm not into that kind of movie scene and all that. But he goes, do you hear how his life turned out? and how Dave O'Mara actually ended up getting the car. So he went through the 70s. He went through all this stuff where he was living for himself, living for the world. You know, nothing was withheld from him. But he got to the end of all that because one thing that was the catalyst to that was a massive lawsuit, federal indictment. He had to get some big powered attorneys, and actually some of the Hollywood actors came in to raise money for him because there was a lot at stake with this case. It wasn't so much just about Harry Reams, it was about the industry in general. But he became a raging alcoholic, hooked on drugs, and by the 80s he was a mess. He couldn't get into any real movie scenes, even though that's what he dreamed of, and that just further spiraled him down. And you know, we read the Bible a lot, and I tell you about Luke 15, there's a story, and it's a parable. It's called the parable of the prodigal son. And the story is so much like this man's life. It's right on. In the story in the Bible, the son took his inheritance, went off and lived this crazy, wild, carefree life, just like Harry did. And in the Bible, he got to the end of himself, was laying there homeless in a trough with pigs eating their food and with nothing left in his life. And at the end of his rope, he decided in the story in the Bible to go back to his father and hopefully just be a servant. Maybe he could do something and come back and at least have a place to lay his head. And in the Bible, the story really reflects Jesus' love for us, that when we repent and come back, he's there with open arms. And that's how that story ends. And that's pretty much what happened with Harry Reams. He got to the end of his life. He found himself in the hospital in New York. He was trying to get treatment because he was there for 30 to 40 days, it said in one of the articles, that being treated for alcoholism, cirrhosis of the liver. He was bleeding internally. When he got out, he didn't change. He grabbed a whole bunch of alcohol, and somehow he woke up in a jail cell in L.A. County. From New York to L.A. County. He couldn't remember how he got there. And some folks bailed him out and told him to go up to Park City, Utah, a place that he used to like. He used to like to ski and all that. And he went up to Park City, Utah, and still was having problems with alcohol. He decided, I'm going to try a 12-step program. It's a program for alcoholics where they try to go and clean up their lives. And early on in that, he had some warrants out for his arrest. A police officer was going to take him in. And Harry said, hey, I'm going to this 12-step program. And this police officer said, great, I'll drive you. And he outlines this in a couple of these articles. He said that the police officer genuinely cared about him as a person and had such a positive message for Harry that it kind of gave him the energy and the will and the desire to change his life. He said, the officer told him, he says, if you could clean yourself up, Harry, you would be such an inspiration to other people because of your story, your backstory, and all of that. You could help other people overcome this addiction. And that's exactly what happened. He stayed with the program. Harry ended up going to church. He became a born-again Christian. And he ended up becoming a real estate agent, as it says in the article, a pretty successful one. He got married and ended up dying there in Park City, Utah at age 65, died of pancreatic cancer. So a lot of that hard living did finally catch up to Harry. But the story of the prodigal son in the Bible and Harry Reams, it's just such a great example. And I've told you I love these cars. I love old cars. I love to restore stuff, and you know that. I mean, I think it's something inside of all of us that we want to restore and fix something. Because deep down inside, I think God hardwired you and me to know that there's something broken in us. And the reality is we can polish cars, repaint them, fix them, and in 20 or 30 years, they're going to rust and decay again. But the only way to repair ourselves is with Jesus Christ. So that's the message to you, son, and hopefully that can be a message that we share with others when we share the story of this car. So, hey, until next time, it's good to have you here in the shop, and thanks for Jordan for doing some video work for me, and we'll see you next time.
All right, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and make sure you donate some money so that Amy doesn't kill him, okay?
All right.